are the Rajasic people. But there is a third category, the Tamasic. You might wonder, why is he not speaking of the Tamasic? Because the Tamasic people means they are in deep sleep. They are not even awakened to their potential. So they are difficult to speak to. Whereas the Rajasic people, who are agitated, selfish, worldly, extroverted, but at least they are acting, and at least they are open to correction. So he speaks only of the Sattvic and the Rajasic, and most of us belong to these two categories. There are very few people who are predominantly Tamasic. So that's why he speaks of these two. In fact, throughout in literature, whether it is Shakespeare or Milton or our own Puranas or any other literature, they speak of they use different words, but they essentially speak of the good and the bad. Mahabharata also speaks of the good and the bad. And then he says, now, I have already spoken at length on the divine. Now this, he's not talking only about the 26 qualities, but he's speaking right from chapter 2 onwards. He has been speaking of the Sattvic variety. He says, now this is the only part in the entire Bhagavad Gita where he actually focuses on the demonic. So he says, now hear from me, O Partha, about the demonic, so that you understand what it is and steer clear of the demonic traits. Verse 7.
Pravrittim cha nivrittim cha janana vidurasuraha na shaucham napi chacharaha na satyam teshu vidyate.
In this verse, he highlights the essential difference between the divine and the demonic, which is knowledge. The divine have knowledge, the demonic are in ignorance. So he says the demonic people do not know, they just don't know what is to be done and what is not to be done. Nor do they have purity, shaucham, good conduct, acharaha, satyam, truth. And this is the essential difference. See, in order to live life successfully, in order to be happy in life and to grow to your potential, you essentially need to know the difference between pravritti and nivritti. Pravritti, that which you ought to do. Nivritti, that which you ought to steer clear of. Acts of commission and omission. So this pravritti and nivritti, this knowledge they don't have, and therefore they do things which they ought not to do, and they don't do things that they ought to do. So Vedanta portrays, classifies actions into 3 grades. The 3 grades of action are, number 1, the highest quality of action is niyatam karma, obligatory duties. Every one of us is placed in a certain situation, are born in a certain environment which places automatic obligations on us. Are you aware of your obligations? Are you fulfilling your obligations? Most of us are not. Why? Because kamya karma takes over. Kamya karma is desire-ridden activities. When you cultivate desires to such an extent that it clouds your intellect, it clouds your vision of what you ought to do and ought not to do, then you neglect your obligatory duties and end up pursuing desire. And when desires mount in your system to such an extent that these desires cannot be fulfilled by ethical, legal, moral means, then you switch, you cross the line to unethical, which is called nishiddha karma. Nishiddha karma is not unethical or immoral or unjust set by society. Nishiddha is something that is prohibited by your own conscience. If you stoop to those actions which your own conscience does not allow, then you're in the worst state. So, depending on, throughout our scriptures, constantly he says, niyatam kuru karmatvam, perform your obligations. Therein lies success. In that lies your happiness. Don't go running after desires. It's a bottomless pit. The more desires you fulfill, the more desires you create, and you end up in a hell of a situation. Therefore, focus only on niyatam karma. What a fabulous tradition we have. And anyone who has followed their niyatam karma reaches the zenith of success, reaches infinite bliss. And the rest of us follow desires. Look at Ravana. He had everything that anybody could hope for. And yet he wanted one more thing, Sita. And that was his undoing. And this is what's happening to all of us. You have so much to enjoy, so much to be grateful for. And all you're thinking of is one more thing that I don't have. So depending on this, there are 4 types of people. The 4 types of people, we'll get into this in more detail tomorrow.